Okay. Hi, everybody. Erica Desper. You all know me by now. I am very excited to be hosting all of these live parent chats. We've had a lot of great topics recently, and most of you that are going to be watching this have a kiddo who has been diagnosed or you suspect is not neurodivergent. And if you know anything about differently wired brains, you know that sleep can be harder to come by for these kiddos. And sleep is something that is near and dear to my heart because I am a sleep coach for babies and children, but my experience is with neurotypical children. So to help us on this topic for our neurodiverse kids, tonight we have Melissa Doman of Melissa Doman Sleep Consulting. She has over 10 years of experience working with families in and around the Philadelphia area, as well as internationally, with a whole variety of diagnoses, including ADD and ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and she is going to help us know how we can help our neurodivergent kids get the sleep they need. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining and tell us everything we need to know.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Erica, so much for having me. And I know that you've been in the field of sleep coaching our families here locally. So, to come on and to be able to talk about how to help kiddos that are neurodivergent kiddos, I'm really excited to talk about it. So just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Melissa Doman, and I started my journey with sleep as a child brain developmentalist and as a therapist myself. For years, I was working with my kids in the office in our sessions together, and they were just exhausted, and I couldn't, we couldn't move forward in their goals. And uh, over and over and over again, parents would be asking me, like, my child's not sleeping. What do we do? What do we do? And I really just didn't know how to answer that question. So ultimately, my research and my journey took me to the concept and the philosophy of sleep training. I did a lot of reading and research and ultimately decided that this was something that I wanted to do and help many, many other families get their kids sleeping well. With given all of the different diagnoses that there are, and how much more, how much more difficult it can be for neurodivergent kids to get sleep. This is really a wonderful thing. It's a great thing to be able to teach parents, and it's just so necessary for our families too. So just give me 1 second. I'm gonna
Sure, go for it.
slides here. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So today what we're going to discuss is, first of all, why is sleep so important, specifically for brain growth and development and supporting the growing brain. What are my top recommendations to help your child sleep better? The 3 common mistakes that are made that I'm going to urge you to avoid. And with any time that we have left, we'll leave it up for questions.
Awesome. Great.
Awesome. So, and I know, Eric, I'm like, some of these things I'll be like preaching to the choir a little bit. So
pretend I am a parent who does not know any of this, please.
okay. Awesome. Well, first of all, what we have to answer that question, like, why is sleep so important? So for me, as a child brain developmentalist, from my standpoint, sleep is crucial to help support that growing brain. And when we have, when a child has a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, it's all the more important that they're getting that good night's sleep, because their brain at that point is able to organize the information it's learned. It's doing its spring cleaning. It's making that brain, that neural network, stronger and stronger. So the more sleep that our kids are getting, it's going to help support them in everything that they're learning and doing during the day, whether with therapy, school, etc. Now, obviously, sleep restores energy. It leaves kids in a better mood, especially for children where maybe sometimes that like emotional regulation can be really difficult. Sometimes you have to ask that question, like, how are you sleeping, kid? Because a lot of times if they're really exhausted, if they're not getting the sleep that they need, of course, those emotions, those moods are going to fluctuate. Um, Sleep is also really important for boosting immunity. The more sleep our kids get, the healthier they are, the bigger and the better those immune defense walls are for our kiddos. And I can speak out of experience, especially in the last year or so, for the families that I work with in that community. Illness is a very common issue. It comes up a lot. So the better we can get them sleeping, the healthier they're going to be
Sure.
for the long term. Um, Sleep is really helpful with reducing hyperactivity. It's crucial for hormone balance. Again, like a lot of the kids that I work with, they tend to be smaller. They tend to be underweight compared to neurotypical children. So making sure they're getting the sleep they need helps with that hormone regulation, weight gain, etc. So again, it's really important for physical growth, heart health, boosting memory, learning is easier. Like there's so many reasons why our kids need to be getting that good night's rest. And we have to think about those ripple effects too. Like, again, if your child is better rested, they're getting the sleep that they need at night and during the day if they're still napping. Um, Again, therapy, treatments, anything that you're doing with your child are going to be that much more effective. School's going to be easier. Their ability to focus and to concentrate on the tasks at hand is going to be easier for them. And for parents, it allows them to really be the caretakers that they want to be. And I know that for the families that I work with, parenting is just one of the many hats that they're wearing. They are advocates, they're nutritionists, they're part-time nurses, they're lawyers. Like there's so many other things that as a parent of a neurodivergent child, like there's so many other things that you need to stay on top of. So making sure that your child is resting so that you're getting a better night's rest is really important for that entire family unit. Now, the unfortunate truth is that our kids are chronically sleep deprived. And actually, a few days ago, I was looking up these statistics for another seminar that I'm doing. But to give an example, like our kids on the autism spectrum, like it's as high as 80% of kids on the autism spectrum have some kind of chronic sleep issue. And for kids with ADHD, ADD, that number is kind of hovering around that same amount. It's almost 3 out of 4 kids have some kind of sleep issue at night. And for the families that I work with, the sleep issues their child is having is not uncommon from a neurotypical child. So maybe they're having a hard time getting to sleep. They're struggling with middle of the night wake ups, early morning wakings, naps aren't successful. But because of the additional things that are going on in the background from a neurological standpoint, a lot of these common sleep issues are just a lot more extreme. So instead of it just being a couple middle of the night wake ups, it's, my kid's up from 1 to 5 a.m. every single night, or it takes my child at least 3 hours to get to sleep, or they're starting their day at 3 a.m. So it's, again, the common sleep struggles are not different from other neurotypical kids. It's just
Sure.
on a profound level.
Sure.
And talking to families in this situation, they can feel really stuck. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had parents say, like, I asked my doctor about my child's sleep issues, and all they had to recommend was melatonin or medications. Like, there's very little information out there for families in this situation with their child, where first of all, it's tailored to their child who is just wired differently, as you said, and or the resources out there. Parents will read through it and they're just like, that's not going to work for my kid. Like, and it's because they know all those additional needs that their child has. So we want to make sure that if we're going to improve that sleep, that we're really looking at that whole child, and taking that whole child approach, not just talking about habits, but we're making sure that the brain is getting the support it needs and the body is getting the support it needs.
Sure. And just to interrupt you for a second, I would assume that we could safely add to this list sleep that's maybe contingent on a parent being present, because that is so common with neurotypical kids. But I know that kids on the spectrum or with ADHD, there's often an anxiety component, which could be like global throughout the day or just relegated to sleep. So I noticed that wasn't on the list, but I wanted to say, if anybody's watching and they feel like they have to stay with their child, or their child's trying to physically crawl back inside their body, that is common too.
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about that as well. And it does say like they haven't quite yet learned their own strategies to sleep, but there's many different layers to that. Some kids have just, from day one, this is how they've learned how to sleep. Something happened and now we're like at a point where kids don't feel comfortable sleeping on their own. And that is very common for my kids with that anxiety around sleep and being autonomous. So definitely it's a factor when it comes to sleep for these kids. Absolutely. All right. So the question is, what do we do about it then?
We all know what the problem is. We may not know the solutions.
Exactly. So the first thing that we have to talk about is finding that ideal bedtime for your child. Now, all of us, our energy, it goes up, it goes down throughout the day on that 24-hour cycle. And that's called our circadian rhythm. So that circadian rhythm dictates and tells us when it's time for us to start going to bed, when it's time to start waking up for the day, when our energy has to be at its highest, at its lowest, etc. Now, for most children, their circadian rhythm is going to dip a lot earlier in the evening than for us. Like most adults, that lowest dip in the circadian rhythm happens around like 10 o'clock or so. All of us technically should be going to bed around that time, although most of us probably don't.
Right.
But again, for our kids, it happens a lot earlier in the evening. So very often, one of the easiest things that we can do to help get that better night's rest is make sure that kids are getting to bed early and at that time where kind of Mother Nature is saying like, hey, here's your window of opportunity. So for most of my kids, like under the age of 8, now as we get like into young babies, like, 2, 1 or younger, it's maybe a little bit different. But for most of my kids under the age of 8, anywhere between 7 to 8 o'clock at night is usually where that dip is happening. And again, we want to take advantage of that. Now, for kids over the age of 8, usually, again, I found that between 8 to 9 o'clock is a good window of time for bedtime. And for teens, ideally, they should be getting into bed by 10 o'clock at the latest. Obviously, sometimes that's a little bit of a harder sell, but we got to make sure that we're trying to stick to that as consistently as possible. Now, when we are consistently missing that window of opportunity, what starts to happen is that kids can get overtired. So we've missed that window to put them down at a time where everything's in sync with each other. It's easy to fall asleep. And they go into that overtired state. And for many kids, overtiredness looks like hyperactivity. It's almost as if like the brain is sending the complete opposite messages. Which
makes it really hard for parents to recognize, right? Because they can see that and say, well, they're not tired at all. They're actually like really alert and like almost wild. They'll never settle down. So kids can be like tricky. I know that was so confusing for me with my son. When he was overtired, I called him a more version of himself. He was like more silly, more funny, but he would laugh almost like you'd be like, something's bad's about to happen. Why is he laughing like that?
Yeah.
Diabolical.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that for a lot of parents, especially for kids on the autism spectrum, so often people like a lot of professionals will see that child where they're like super hyperactive, constantly on the go, day and night, and they're like, "Oh, but look how much energy they have. They don't need that much sleep." So there's that very common misconception that kids on the spectrum just don't need as much rest, and it's like, no, nothing can be further from the truth. And very often that like that hyperactive behavior and that constantly on the go, that when we see that, it's actually like, no, this kid just is really chronically overtired.
Mhm.
So now there is actually like a neurological reason why we see all of that. And so like for kids when they are overtired, they've actually done studies to show this, but the area of the brain that starts to become overactive is this like the back part of the brain. And this area of the brain controls sensory integration,
Mm.
behavior, language, balance and coordination, all sorts of things. And of course, like right smack in the middle of that area of the brain is that pineal gland that is like controlling how much melatonin goes into the system,
Right.
how sleepy we feel, things like that. So when kids are overtired, again, this area of the brain starts to become overactive, and that's why we see those big sweeping changes in behavior, and we see those like opposite messages being sent.
Mhm.
Um, so anyway, so again, like just to conclude on this one, like it's really important. We got to find that ideal bedtime for your child. And again, it's safe to assume for the most part that the earlier the better when it comes to bedtime and making sure we're meeting that window of opportunity. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. I do have some kids who tend to be more of like a night owl or a morning lark. Right now, I'm working with a child who is on a like 5:30 to 4:30 a.m. schedule.
I'm
uh,
glad they're not mine. I would not enjoy that schedule.
yeah. So again, some kids are just earlier, and there are very like gradual ways that we can change that. But for the most part, um, over the years, I've had parents tell me over and over and over again, like this was one of the changes that they made where they saw some of the most immediate changes with their child's like overall quality of sleep. Um, and of course, the nice thing about like Mother Nature giving us this sign, early on in the evening, she's saying, "Hey, the kid's supposed to go to sleep. Like, you need some time to yourself here," right? Um, so, again, with all the hats that parents wear, it's really important. Like, sometimes getting your kid to bed earlier, it's good for them and their circadian rhythm and all of that, but it's good for you as well, just to have that time at the end of the day to decompress, to get yourself organized for the next day, whatever that may bring.
Sure.
Um, okay, now again, the second thing is not groundbreaking in any way when it comes to our neurodivergent kids, but when it comes to bedtime, we want to make sure that we're keeping that consistent routine. Now, there's that neurological component of when we follow the same list of activities night after night after night, it starts to cue the brain and body. It's time to start shutting down. It's time to start going to sleep. And of course, for all of the kids that are represented here, it creates that predictability, it creates that routine. And when the day can be so crazy back and forth with school and all sorts of different things, having that one bedtime routine at the end of the day, which is super predictable, it's relaxing. It can help any child, especially for kids who tend to be a bit more anxious. It can really help them with just that wind down and relaxation before bed.
Mhm.
Now, this of course depends on a child's age, but my bedtime routines that I've designed for kids tend to be anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour long. And that's because we have to make sure that we're meeting all needs, not just the practical ones of like, did we go to the potty, brush teeth, have that last sip of water, anything like that. But if a child does have other sensory needs, we got to make sure that those are addressed in that bedtime routine as well. Um, Now, I do recommend that parents go back and forth and they take turns. First of all, it shouldn't be one person's job exclusively to put your child to bed. But for the kids that I've worked with, when they can go down for both parents, it becomes a lot easier to go down for a grandparent, a babysitter, etc. later on. So from the take turns back. They're not used to just like it being exclusively one parent. Now, before I show you maybe like an example bedtime routine, the two things that we have to make sure that we're not including in the routine is really, high energy playtime. So like no roughhousing with the kids or like jumping around in dance parties. And the other thing is screen time. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we don't want to use anything that could potentially delay that onset of sleep, especially if a child has issues getting themselves to sleep initially for the night.
Sure.
Okay, so an example bedtime routine. This is a fairly standard one. So the first step is like we do some kind of quiet play. So playing with Legos, magnet tiles, puzzles, things like that. Then we go into maybe some light stretching, and it doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. It could just be like reaching overhead, touching toes, butterfly stretches. I find, especially for my school age kids, it's a nice little outlet to just get some final yayas out of the system. But it's a good way to kind of release any of those little tiny stressors that maybe have built up during the day. And especially for my more sensory seeking kids, just like being able to stress, putting some light pressure on the joints helps to kind of meet that tactile need. And then we would go into maybe that next step. Again, if we need a little bit more tactile input, doing some massage, joint compression massage is really effective for my kids. And I almost put it in like almost all of my plans, especially for my sensory seekers. But for my kids that have high anxiety, it can also be a really great way to help, just wind down the system, relax things a little bit. And it's just really good one-on-one time with child and parent as well.
And if a parent doesn't know what that means,
yeah,
you explain or show or.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So joint compression massage is a technique where essentially from head to toe at like all the major joints of the body, we're gently pushing the joint together. So if I were doing it on my elbow, I would hold right below and right above and just very gently push the joint together like that.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And the great thing is that, it's not the best, resource sometimes, but there's a lot of really great joint compression massage videos on YouTube and online.
I always tell parents that. I love YouTube for parents. I don't love it for my kid.
Yeah. For parents, it's good. Yeah, there's a double-edged sword.
For sure.
Yeah. No, but there's a lot of great tutorial videos for parents as well. So again, if you have a child who maybe it tends to be more of a sensory seeker, or maybe a little bit more on that high anxiety scale, like that can be a really great activity to do. And then of course, like we're going to get into our usual bedtime routine stuff. So bath, brush teeth, potty, PJs, read a book, and then lights out. Now, for the other thing that I would recommend here around bedtime routine is it's really important that at many steps as possible, you're giving your child the choice of things, right? So like maybe for that first step of playtime, do you want to play with Legos or you want to do puzzles? What colored PJs do you want to wear? What do you want as your bedtime snack before we go to bed? Having that choice allows them to feel like their bedtime routine is really their thing. It's their routine. It's not mom or dad or whoever telling them that they have to do this, even though it is. But by giving those kind of controlled choices, it allows them to have a little bit more independence around the whole process. And especially if we're trying to get a child to sleep a bit more independently, allowing some choices there can really facilitate that process of getting to sleep on their own. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is just screen time and physical activity. Now, I mentioned screen time as a thing we want to avoid in a bedtime routine. And that's simply just because the exposure that we have to screens, whether it's laptop, cell phone, tablet, whatever, it's releasing a blue light that tricks our brain into thinking it's still daytime. So what that does is it delays that release of that sleep hormone melatonin from going into our systems. And again, it starts to throw off the different body rhythms around circadian rhythm and things like that. So what I would recommend is, like, just to start off, try to cut screens at least 1 hour before bedtime. Now, for some of my kids who tend to be a bit more sensitive from a sensory standpoint, we may even have to have that discussion of like capping screens at a certain amount of time during the day as well. I've worked with kids where if they go over, 30 minutes of screen time during the day, we'll see on their sleep log that night that they're up a bunch of times. They took a lot longer to fall asleep, even if parents stuck to the 1 hour before bed rule, right? So for a lot of my kids who tend to have that more sensitive system, that time during the day can accumulate. So we got to be careful with that. Now, when it comes to physical activity, of course, like, movement creates the need to sleep. If we're not getting that outlet to burn energy, there's not as strong of a need to sleep. So for my kids who are walking and running, I do recommend getting out for a walk at least a few times a week, anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes. And there have been loads and loads of studies that have shown even just like walking 3 times a week, it's like a really ridiculous amount, has a really positive impact on sleep and the quality and the amount of hours that we get. Now, I want to mention this as well, because for a lot of the kids that I work with, there are those kids that are super high energy. They're jumping on things. They're going back and forth between the house, running around. And parents very innocently look at that and they say, oh, they're getting plenty of physical activity. But a lot of times there's something disorganized about it. There's something chaotic about it. So walking is good to help burn that energy to go to sleep, but it's also good to just help slow down the gears a little bit in the brain and just get like a more regular pattern of movement. And one of the things, what I've learned over the years is that there can be too much of a good thing. So often when we have those high energy kids, the temptation is to get them out and, go outside for 5 hours a day, do all these different activities. But what I've found over the years is that kids do have a tolerance level as well. And similar to, screens and getting too much of it, I also see that on sleep logs as well. Like, if, I'll tell parents like, hey, we went over 3 hours and you see like we had 3 wake ups last night. I think we need to start putting a cap on it. So even physical activity, as much as like we want to burn that energy, we have to keep things in balance as well. All right, so let's talk about room environment, because this is going to set things up a little bit for factoring in sensory needs when it comes to sleep. So when it comes to the room environment, there are 3 things that I encourage all of my families. Number 1, it must be dark for sleep. It has to be cool and it has to be peaceful, quiet, calm, however you want to say it. Now, the darkness in the room is really important because there are some kids where it's just like that tiny sliver of light that's coming from outside the window or underneath the door, that if we don't cut that, like cutting that out could be the difference between that 4 a.m. wake up in the morning and extending all the way to 6 a.m., 7 a.m., whatever that wake up time is in the morning. Now, there are some kids where like sleeping in a completely dark room is a no-go. Like that does not feel comfortable for them. They would be more reassured if they had something in their room. So of course, use a night light. I would encourage you to stick to a warmer color like pink, red, orange, yellow, and avoid projectors up on the ceiling, anything with a blue light tinge. We have to be mindful of. Now, when it comes to temperature, for a lot of my kids, especially my kids with autism, with ADHD, they tend to run very hot body temperature wise. They tend to be a degree or two higher than average kids, which is okay. But it's all
I didn't know that, and it makes sense for mine. So I'm glad to hear you say he runs so hot, and I'm like piled in a cape of blankets and pillows and flannel pajamas.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes I have to have that conversation with parents. I'm like, stop putting blankets on. They don't need it. And they're like, but they're going to get cold. And it's like, no. It's okay. Like, let them dictate what gets put on them. Because so often my kids just tear all of that stuff off anyway. But it is important, again, like that room temperature, it has to be cool. So I encourage parents, nothing higher or hotter than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, if overall quality of sleep or middle of the night wake ups is an issue for your child, this is a really important point, because if the room is not cool enough, your child could just very well be fluctuating like in these lighter stages of sleep and not really getting into like the deep restorative stages that they need to. Now, when it comes to the rest of the room environment, I do recommend that it's free of clutter, it's safe. There's not a ton of things that your child can get into, especially for kids who might be early risers. Like if there's the temptation of getting into the bookshelf or this thing or that thing, those things might have to just live in another place temporarily. But also for my children who tend to have anxiety or tend to be more anxious, we also have to look at that room and see like, where is it just too busy? Because if it's just too visually busy, it doesn't necessarily communicate calmness, calm or whatever. And one of the first things I have a lot of my parents do is go in their child's room with their child and ask like, what needs to change here, right? And the answers sometimes really surprise parents. Like some kids will say, I want my bed over here, or, I want to take this thing out, or I need to have this in here. Obviously we can't like let them make a choice over like, the color of the room. Like that's not an easy change, but if your child is not feeling settled in their sleep at night and things like that, I've seen it time and time again, just like going through the room and making it a space that feels comfortable for them is really helpful. Okay, so let's talk about sensory needs for better sleep. Now, for most kids who have sensory processing issues, no matter how mild or how severe, often will have difficulty getting to sleep and maintaining sleep. And that's simply just because those sensory areas of the brain, although they're not working as hard, they're still kind of like on the prowl. They're still scanning the environment at night, making sure that there's nothing threatening, there's nothing to worry about, fear, etc. So now it does go both ways. For some kids who are sensory seeking, if the brain is not getting enough of that stimulation during the day, regardless of what sensory pathway we're going down, if it's not getting what it needs, it's going to be agitated and it's going to look for that stimulation at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., because it just didn't get enough of it. Now, that being said, like there are also like we have to keep things in balance. If a child is getting too much stimulation during the day, um, it's going to put the brain into overdrive. And very often it's these kids that tend to deal with anxiety and sleep. And if you think about it, if you're living during the day in a world that is brighter, louder, feels different, and you have this energy that needs an outlet, um, that overstimulation is also going to cause issues with sleep quality at night. So we have to strike that balance, but when those alarm bells are going off, we need to cut out the chaos, and we need to give the body and brain exactly what it needs. Now, for some of you, this may not be a surprise, but for others, it may be a surprise. Like, of course, we have our 5 external sensory pathways. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling. But we also have our balance, our ability to balance ourselves. Our vestibular system is a sensory system. The need and the desire to move, that proprioceptive, that's a sensory system. How we're feeling emotionally, the body urges that we're feeling during the day. This is another sensory pathway. So there are many, many different things that are going on in the day. And if we think about it, like if there are 8 different pathways that need help, then yeah, that's going to that could potentially throw off sleep. Now, some of the things that I've talked about already, they're the first steps when it comes to balancing that sensory system. So again, at night, keeping it dark, avoiding blue lights as much as possible. When it comes to tactility, making sure that the environment itself is staying cool. For some kids, we do have to sheets or the blankets and things like that. And again, for many of my kids with that sensory seeking who want those tight hugs, squeezes, things like that, we have to give that sensory system the stimulation it needs. So in addition to like joint compression, massage, there may be other tactile activities I would recommend to parents. So having sensory bins. One of my team members, Katie, during bath time, she'll recommend using shaving cream on the bathroom wall and like playing around with that. Of course, that's like for some of my younger kids, but again, it's a great way to meet that tactile need before sleep. Now, when it comes to hearing, for a lot of the kids I work with, most of the time it's sensitivity to sound. So that can look like a lot of different things. It could be, of course, the typical thing of covering the ears, avoiding certain sounds, having to warn your child ahead of time, like, okay, I'm going to turn on X, Y, and Z, right? But it could also mean, hypersensitivity can also be seen for kids who tend to tune out very easily, who seem just generally very distracted, who maybe don't do well in crowded areas. Like there are many, many signs of that we can see during the day. So when it comes to sleep at night, we got to make sure that we're cutting those things out as much as possible. So actually for most of my children that I work with, if they're using white noise, it's one of the first things I actually take out of their sleep environment, just because it's a background noise that the brain is just constantly tuning into. And I've had dozens of parents tell me like they took the white noise out and it was the first time they saw their kids sleep through the night for subsequent nights in a row, like ever. So it's a really simple thing, but incredibly effective. Just keeping the environment nice and quiet. Now, when it comes to smell and taste, there's not like a ton that we can do here. But it's important to bring up that for a lot of kids, they do have oral sensitivities, meaning that during the day, they're putting a lot of things in their mouth. They have certain toys or things that they like to chew on. And it can make it difficult when it comes to trying to take away certain props at night, like pacifiers or bottles or things like that. For a lot of my kids that I work with, that's not just like something they need to go to sleep. Like it's actually regulating the oral needs that they have. So if that's the case for your child, there may be like additional stimulation activities that you need to do during the day to help with meeting that need before bedtime. So it's again, it's sensory to a certain point, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to things like the vestibular and the proprioceptive things, very often that is handled through physical activity during the day. But for some of my kids, like I will recommend sensory swings, or doing some rolling on the floor, or rolling up in the blanket, and then doing like burrito rolls and stuff like that. But these are the biggies when it comes to sensory. Okay. Oh, I don't know why that came up differently. Okay. So the other thing that we have to consider is that we need to make sure that the body is getting the nutrients it needs for a good night's sleep. Okay. Our stomach in many ways is a second brain, and there are hundreds of millions of neurons in the stomach, basically to kind of handle the dirty work of digestion. Mother Nature has put millions of neurons in our digestive system, so the brain can do the really sophisticated things that it needs to. So very often when the body is getting things that really shouldn't be there, or it's hard to digest, what happens is that the brain has to divert energy to the stomach and divert resources there. And one of the first things is affected is overall sleep quality at night. So again, we have to balance things out here a little bit. So the first thing that I would recommend to a lot of my families is just start reducing the amount of sugar, candy, soda, chocolate, processed foods, things like that. Now, for my families who have picky eaters, meaning like they only have a certain amount of foods that they work with, you got to do the best you can. I've worked with kids who only eat 4 or 5 different foods, and most of them are in that category of things that really should be reduced during the day. So again, if you tend to have a pickier eater, do your best with reducing those things. I would say maybe start by like at dinner time or the afternoon snack. We try to give more sleep healthy foods, which I'll discuss a little bit in a second. But just starting that process, if we reduce them at a certain time of the day, the body is able to digest it better. It's kind of out of the system before bed, so we know that it's not going to aggravate any other sleep issues. And I would also recommend that you give sleep boosting foods to your child. So foods that are rich in magnesium, which help the body feel relaxed, calcium and vitamin B6, which our body needs to actually create and produce melatonin. These and more, of course, but these are the big ones. Making sure that those nutrients, those minerals are in our child's diets is really important. Now, there's a lot of different foods that is in that category. We have cherries, which are like a natural source of melatonin. Bananas are good for vitamin B6, for magnesium, certain vegetables, animal proteins, certain nuts and seeds. These are really good to give the brain and body what it needs to just have a good night's sleep. And I would recommend like having kind of a sleep boosting dinner where maybe we have like a little bit of turkey or chicken, like a poultry or a fish, some nice vegetables and things like that. But those things can really help with overall quality of sleep at night. And these are also things like if you have a picky eater and you're looking at these foods on the screen, you're like, no way, this is not going to happen. You can always supplement with magnesium, calcium, etc. but you want to make sure that you check with your child's pediatrician, or if you have a nutritionist that you're working with, check with them about dosing and stuff like that. But these can also be supplemented, like I said, for kids who tend to be pickier eaters. Okay, now finally,
the big one.
The big one, yeah. It's as much as we can talk about like sleep environment and nutrition and physical activity, like all of these things are really important, but it's crucial that we're also making sure that your child has the space to learn how to fall asleep on their own without external prompts. And I'll give some examples of those in a second. But all of us, we have our journey, our own journey into sleep. We all have our own ways of doing it. For myself, I know, like, okay, I start on my right side and then I flip to my left side. I put my arms in a certain position and then I'm out. And I've done that for years and years and years and years and years. And I would say probably like at least 85% of the kids that I work with have yet to figure out what is their way to go to sleep. They rely on mom or on parents in some way, shape, or form to go to sleep at night. Now, for some kids, that could be co-sleeping. Like the only way they can fall asleep is if mom or dad is lying right next to them, or if they can put their hands under mom, or they have their feet tucked under in this way. It could be rocking, it could be cradling, it could be going out for a drive in the car. Every once in a blue moon, I get one of those kids that the only way they can fall asleep is with movement in the car. Sometimes the prop can be something as simple as just like needing a parent out in the hallway in view. They maybe don't need that touch to go to sleep, but they need that reassurance, like, okay, mom or dad is there, I'm fine, I can go to sleep. The problem with not having that strategy, their own way to get to sleep, is that they may be able to initiate sleep at the beginning of the night, but if they wake up middle of the night, they're going to look for that help over and over and over again. And we actually, all of us wake up very briefly a few times throughout the night when we've gone through a cycle of sleep. So we wake up briefly, we reset, and we go right back to sleep. And because we have our own ways of doing it, we don't even remember waking up. But so often for kids, if they're not able to initiate sleep on their own in the beginning of the night, like I said, they're going to look for that help over and over and over.
I always say it's like level 1 and level 2. Like we wouldn't expect them to be able to do level 2 if they didn't do level 1. And sometimes parents are like, oh, right, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So, so when it comes to it, like if your child is struggling with initiating sleep for the night, middle of the night wake ups, anything like that, you like taking that really close look at how are they actually falling asleep for the night? Are they completely autonomous? And if not, then that's probably one of the steps that you'll want to take in order to improve that overall sleep quality. And for those 85% of kids that I work with, once they finally have their own strategies and they're confident in their strategies, those issues that they've been having with their sleep for weeks, months, or years, all of a sudden are significantly better or just completely resolved, right? And what I love about teaching independence and sleep to my families is that for many of the kids that I work with, this is like one of the first things that they learn how to do independently. And for so many kids with neurodevelopmental diagnoses, they've relied on parents and caretakers and therapists and this and that to do the things they need to in daily life. And the beauty of sleep is that you can teach a child to sleep independently, irregardless of where they are in their abilities. I've taught kids who are constantly on the go, very like vocal and super bright and super intelligent and like understand everything. to learn how to sleep independently. But I've also taught kids who are blind and immobile and on multiple medications to do it as well. So that's the great thing about sleep. It doesn't matter where your child is in their abilities or what they haven't been able to learn how to do yet. Like, it's going to happen, but regardless of where they are, like, teaching them how to sleep independently and to get that good quality sleep at night is always a possibility. Now,
would you agree that even if a parent being present with physical touch, without physical touch, even if it's reassuring, it can also be overstimulating, which is sometimes one of the reasons why it's taking them so long to fall asleep. They want you there, but if you're there, they can't really get down to that level.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, I think for a lot of families who reach out to me who have maybe tried sleep training on their own or with, you know, whoever, they inherently know that, like, that need to have somebody there with them or to have that rocking and holding, like, there's a little bit more to it. There is like a sensory regulation thing as well. So for those kids, it's really important that during the day, we're meeting those needs as much as possible. So they're less and less likely to look for it at night, for sure. And like you said, some kids are so sensitive that, like, even if mom or dad just moved a little bit, like, boom, they're up, right? Because again, their system is just that sensitive. So, you know, there's layers to it for sure. But again, regardless of where they are, like, that's something that they can learn how to do on their own. We just have to make sure that those needs are met and it's done in a way and in a process that's super gradual and allows a kid to be successful and to learn that one step before we go to the next one and the next one and the next one. Okay, so quickly, I just want to go over, like, the 3 common mistakes that a lot of parents are told or maybe do, that we want to try and avoid. And the first one is, again, making bedtime later or skipping naps. Again, so often my families have been told, like, oh, your kid's so high energy, or they have the autism diagnosis, blah, blah, blah. They don't need that much sleep. Nothing can be further from the truth. Like, so if your child has been struggling to go to sleep, can't maintain it, the last thing you want to do is skip naps and make bedtime later. If first you want to do all the other things that I've talked about before you start making those kind of adjustments. And the second one I've kind of touched on already, of, like, physical activity definitely has to be in balance, and you have to make sure that you're doing the right ones for your child as well. So again, we got to make sure that we strike that balance there. And then the last thing is not sticking to changes long enough. And Erica, I'm sure you know this as well. Like, I've talked to dozens and dozens of families who they say, oh, well, we've tried it. And it's like, okay, all right, tell me, how many nights did you actually try it? Well, maybe a couple. And then, you know, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to move forward. So we ended up throwing in the towel. And, you know, what I want to say is, like, whether you're picking one thing or all of the things that I've discussed tonight, you got to give your child time, and we got to give that time for processing and understanding around these different changes. So sometimes, and look, sometimes it's going to feel like, should we continue these things? And really the answer is yes. Like, give your child that space to learn and to allow that consistency to come through, because when you do, that's when you start to see changes, and that's when you start to see traction.
And I always give parents the weight loss analogy. Like, you could decide to lose weight and you could eat healthy all day and exercise really hard, and then you get on the scale and you're like, what? But it just doesn't, like, it doesn't happen that fast, right? It doesn't even happen within a few days. It, like, takes the body time to adapt to those changes. So that doesn't mean you should give up. It just means you actually need to keep going. It's the not seeing the results, though, that can be, you know, just a little disheartening.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a great analogy. And yeah, you gotta persist a little bit. You gotta stick with it. and those changes will come. But yeah, like you said, we just have to be patient and know that what we're putting into the system is we're going to reap those rewards.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So, just to kind of conclude, again, like when it comes to our kids who are neurodivergent, like there's so many different elements when it comes to sleep. And as I said in the beginning, like it's really important that we're taking that like whole child approach, and we can't just exclusively like focus on the habits and the sleep training part of it. Like we got to make sure that that brain and body balance is in there as well. And ultimately every family that and every family that I work with, we're going to incorporate all of those things. And what I've learned over the last 6 years is that when all of these elements are working together for your child, in it's customized to them, like that's ultimately when we're going to see success in getting them sleeping better. Yeah. So
Awesome. Am I unmuted? Okay. Awesome. Excellent. Thank you. That was really helpful. I have some questions of my own, but we do have one in the chat, and that's probably the best one to do next. Melissa that asked the question, can you unmute if you want to, or just put it in the chat? How old is your child? But in the meantime, my keyboard died, or I would have typed that to you. She asked, can you give an example of how to encourage independent sleep, how to encourage independence with their sleep? My son needs me to lay with him. I'd love to hear strategies to get him to be more independent. And she said he's 4. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, first of all, Melissa, I think the first thing you have to do is that prep work ahead of time. Like we can't just say tomorrow night, like, this is what we're doing, because that's not going to go well at all. So what I would recommend is, first of all, start with maybe like if there's anything that you need to change in the bedtime routine or the bedroom environment, like that's actually the first step that you want to take. A tool that I utilize with a lot of my families is a social story specifically around bedtime and what those changes are going to look like for your, like specifically Melissa, for your son. So that social story is basically just something that you write up for him to say, hey, it's time to get a great night's sleep, buddy. You can do this on your own, however you want to word it. We do our bedtime routine, and mommy is going to fill in the blank. So sit here, do this, do that until you go to sleep. And that page is going to change as you start to encourage more independence with him. Now, if your son needs you to lay with him at the moment to go to sleep, what I would encourage you to do is thinking about the sleep situation as it is, like, what is the one change that you can make that's going to take that little step towards independence? So, a really good example of this is, I have a kid right now that I'm working with who's basically co-sleeping. And mom and I decided that the one change is that instead of lying down next to him, she's just going to sit next to him. Right. And we're going to get used to that. And then when he's cool with mom just sitting next to him, like eventually, gradually, we're going to move her farther and farther out of the sleep situation. But it's really important that we don't make those changes too quickly. Because again, like Melissa, for your son, like we got to give him that space to understand and to learn, like, okay, mom's not doing this. Now she's doing this one thing. What does that look like? How do I feel about it? Etc. And once you start to see success with that, then you can move on to the next step and the next step and the next step from there.
And that can be really irritating for parents because it's slow, right? Like we're like, I want to get out tonight, right? But you kind of have to meet kids. I think if you make a big change with these types of kids, it just might be too much drama to get to your destination. So I always say that's like the ladder approach. Like as long as you're coming down one rung, even if it's one rung at a time, you're still on your way like down to the ground. It is going to take a little longer than if you just let go and jump down.
Yeah.
But it can still get you there. So that's great.
Yeah.
What would you say? I don't know, Melissa, if you have any follow-up questions, but like, what if a child really resists even that tiny, tiny change? Do you just kind of like, could there be some upset where we just say like, this is the spot I'm sitting in now. I'm sorry, you're sad.
Yeah.
And we still have to get used to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, you know, for every kid, there's going to be that moment of like, where they realize like, parents are not joking around, like this is really happening. And for some kids it doesn't happen until like later on when parents have made that like big move out of the room and they're like, oh no, there's sometimes it's right off the bat, like, why aren't you laying down next to me? Why is like what's going on here, right? And I think the thing that we have to take comfort in is that like as parents, and as a parent, like, you know, you've done the best routine for your child. Like you've met their needs, you've had all that one-on-one time during the bedtime routine. And if we're looking at that light at the end of the tunnel of like, you know, teaching your child how to sleep on their own and to sleep really well, at a certain point, yes, sometimes the conversation just has to be like, I understand that you're really upset. And I actually have like a little script that I'll have my families follow. And it's basically, I can see, you know, enter emotion here. I understand, you know, that you don't want this change or whatever, but this is what we're doing, right? And 60% of the time, if we're just meeting that frustration, the kid's like, oh, okay, girl's really listening to me. I get it now. Like, but you know, that's why we have to take such small steps, because there are some kids where if that step is too big, the amount of blowback that we're going to get is going to be too much. And I know there are some kids that I work with where they go into that like sensory meltdown, like it's going to take hours to calm down from it. So usually those tiny steps, if they're small enough at the beginning, we avoid that meltdown completely. But at the same time, like when we've made that decision, like, okay, we're going to do the independence thing, we're going to work on that, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes there does have to be that conversation of like, I love you, bud, or I love you, sweetie, but this is what we're doing. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Okay. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know a lot of the stuff we talked about was more geared toward younger kids, but back at the beginning, when you were talking about optimal bedtimes, you did mention teens and how their rhythms start to shift later. And since I'm the parent of a 12 and a half, almost 13-year-old, I have witnessed this. I remember the days when he used to go to bed at 7:30 and we had like 3 hours to ourselves. And then that we noticed it wasn't really working well. It was taking too long and we adjusted, and we've done many adjustments along the way. And now we all go to bed at the same time, which is different. Can't say that I love it. But I think it's a challenge, and there may not be an answer for this, but if a teenager's rhythm really is just set so that they aren't sleepy until 10ish, but they need to be up for school, very early the next morning, they're going to be sleep deprived. So is there anything to be done about that? I mean, can that rhythm be shifted, or is it really like get what you can and don't fight it?
No, I mean, it can be shifted, but we have to keep in mind, like, especially for younger teens and teens, like there is a natural shift in that circadian rhythm. Like teenagers do become night owls for a while. And there's a great book, I'm looking at the title, Why We Sleep, by Dr.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Walker. I have that right here.
Yeah. But he talks about this shift in the book. It's almost Mother Nature's way of saying, like, okay, you need to be more independent. Like that's your independent time,
Right.
for those teens. So it naturally does happen. But, if there is a time that, a child has to, or a teen has to be up for school, we need to kind of count that time back and make sure that they're getting the number of hours. So, for a lot of the teenagers that I've worked with where we do have this kind of time that we need to get to bed, one of the first things that I recommend along with the bedtime routine is actually doing a bit more physical activity. Now it doesn't have to be anything too crazy, but sometimes just that, especially after like a really busy day at school,
Right.
helps, it gives enough of that slow down effect with the gears running and things like that, allows that earlier bedtime to happen more easily.
Yeah.
Now, for some kids or some teenagers that I've worked with, I've also used like bright light therapy in order to start shifting that circadian rhythm earlier, later, as needed, in order to basically get onto a sleep schedule that's more like
Yes, I'm an
reasonable,
adequate
normal.
total.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And screens obviously are difficult with teenagers and teenagers. So I'm sure all parents know the advice, like don't let them have it in the bed or the bedroom and have everybody put them away by a certain time. But do you have any thoughts or experience on things like blue blocking glasses and blue blocking filters? I know the research has been sort of changing about that.
Yeah, I have recommended blue light blocking glasses for some of my teenagers that I've worked with, just because it's like, parents and I agree, okay, we got to pick our battles here, right?
Mhm.
And in those cases that I've used them, they have been helpful. Not always, but we've used those when some of these other things are in place as well, around like consistent bedtime routine and some of the nutritional things as well, to make sure that just sleep can come more easily. But I'm wearing a pair of blue light blocking glasses myself right now. So they can be helpful.
Yeah.
So if you have a kid where it's like a teenager where it's really hard to get the devices and things like that put away,
Right.
maybe the compromise we have to strike is using those.
Got it. Okay. And back to finding an optimal bedtime. I have two questions to follow up to that. How specific could a parent need to, I mean, I kind of know the answer to this, but I'm asking for parents who may not know. For these kiddos that are sensitive to like total screen time for the day and the level of activity, could they also be hypersensitive to sort of missing their window by something that's seemingly insignificant to us as logical adults, like 10 minutes or something like that?
Yeah. No, definitely. And sometimes it can be really difficult to know because like the window is this small, right? And we have this really short window of opportunity, and then it just like it's a complete one.
I always say, like a train leaving the station. The train doesn't care if you were 2 minutes late or 20 minutes late. You're not on it.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of kids that I work with where they just really have very sensitive circadian rhythms. So, that's one of the reasons why I have all of my families write down sleep logs of like, okay, we're going to bed at this time and that time. And, I've had kids where it's literally 5-10 minutes later and like we finally hit that window, right?
That's how my son was. I would not have believed that it would be possible for a child to be sensitive to a 5 or 10 minute difference had I not seen it with my own eyes so many times over that I was like, okay, fine. I believe it.
Yeah,
and it's pretty unforgiving. I mean, it's not an easy thing to honor every night. But knowing's half the battle. Do you have an easy way for parents to try to determine that? So you mentioned a log. What are they looking for? How quickly their child falls asleep, how the overnight goes, like how will they know if they have or have not hit that window? Hyperactivity?
Yeah. It sometimes it can be hard. I would say you've kind of hit some of the major ones. So like if a kid is falling asleep anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes, that's a good that's a good sign for me. Middle of the night wake ups are happening less and less for sure. Just because if we're hitting that right window, again, that circadian rhythm and everything else is kind of working in sync with each other. So we're not going to hit these like little bumps in the road, for sure. And then also like morning time as well, is morning now starting to extend to like kind of a, a manageable wake up time,
Mhm.
right?
Got it.
But I encourage parents to look at their child's like behavior, like that hour or so before their usual bedtime. Like, are there signs that they're missing ahead of time that are actually signs of overtiredness?
Mhm.
A lot of times when parents send that like first questionnaire to me, I'll say like, what does tired look like? And they name it. And I'm like, that's overtired. Like you're missing. uh, so there is an element of that too. So like if you've been just writing down the sleep, having like a little journal for yourself as well, like that hour and a half before bedtime, just writing down like what are some common, like some things that you're noticing as they're getting into bedtime. And if you start to see those commonalities, again, that's a good sign. Like that's like that maybe 20 minutes earlier or whatever, like that is really their window.
Yeah.
And
Okay, great.
based on
So I
that.
have two last quick questions and then I'll let you go. If anybody has any others, now's the time to pop them in there. So to play devil's advocate for a moment, and you totally can tell me that I'm wrong if you want to, would it be possible for a kid who's a sensory seeker to actually need sounds and light to feel sort of settled for sleeping? Whereas most of our focus tonight has been on like dark and quiet and, minimal. And I'm asking personally because I have one. I have one of those. And we tried all the dark and the quiet, and we found he actually is way less anxious. He has like a podcast running quietly in the background. It's always the same episode, so it's boring. And various versions of lights. I won't even tell everybody because I'd be super embarrassed, especially to tell you. But it seems to work for him. So can they be kind of opposite when there is a sensory component, particularly being a seeker?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say probably for me, I'll get a kid like this maybe once every 5 or 6 months where
Okay.
we've tried taking it out, we've worked on independence, and there are just clearly signs that we have to put it back in. So in those rare moments that I do see that, I think like something like a podcast playing in the background for older kids works, for sure. I have suggested that every once in a while. I had a child that I worked with recently who's 8 years old, and we ended up using something called the Yodo player, and which is like it's like a,
Probably like the Tony.
yeah, kind of like a Tony, exactly. But parents were able to limit it, so they didn't want him using it like all night long. So they
Right.
would put a timer on it to say, okay, Oliver, like if you're really struggling to sleep, you can do this for 20 minutes or so. And that's what he needed. So there's definitely like there's still going to be times where kids are going to wake up and the brain's going to be looking for that input. Like there's only so much we can do to stay ahead of it. Like there's still going to be times where they're going to be like, all right, it's 2 a.m. I need this.
Right. Right, exactly.
So,
All right, good.
yeah.
And finally, so what if a parent is watching this and they're like, all right, I know all this, I've done all this, like none of it made a difference. Why is it sometimes different to work with you or your team? Like, what does that look like, and why does it end up going better than when we sometimes as parents try to do it ourselves?
Yeah. Well, look, I think especially for families who have like tried it all, and trust me, I've like on that first call that I do with families, I've had parents tell me like, did that. And I'm like, no. Wait. Because, so often like we have all these different tips and tools and things like flying around, but to have somebody there to say, hey, I understand what your kid is going through. I've seen this before. I think based on this, and this, these are the tools that we have to implement. Having somebody there to kind of referee and just say, all right, we need to keep going with this. Let's make this adjustment. Sometimes that's the accountability that we need. And so often when parents have tried things and they ended up quitting, it's just because they're not really sure what to be looking for? What is typical? Is this, what's really unusual? So, for me and my team of sleep coaches, like, that's what we're here for. We're here to say what you're seeing is totally normal, and to give that reassurance and confidence to parents, like, they're moving in the right direction. And if things really, like, if something's just not clicking, we're there to problem solve and to support parents and
Because
really.
you do have to adjust for each kid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine that's even more true. I mean, that's true of neurotypical children. They're not like one plan fits all, but I would think if your brain's differently wired, it's just so individual, especially with the sensory component. They could be seekers, avoiders, they could be combo.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you really take you're looking at all the pieces and all the results and adjusting it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And trust me, like, there are times where we have to call audibles like 3 weeks in of like, okay, you know what? Like, we're going to go this path this time, and we're going to plug away with it. But, to have somebody there in your corner to support you through this process, and to give parents that reassurance, like, we're moving in the right direction, we're getting there, and to just have that whole picture perspective on your child and their sleep issues, like, that's where you're going to see success. Like, that's, having that support and that guidance, can be really helpful, especially if you've tried all the things.
Right. Especially if you feel like you've tried everything. Well, it's very good to know that even differently wired kids can learn to sleep and sleep independently and sleep well. Lastly, just tell everybody where they can find you, and we'll get everybody out of here.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is melissadomansleepconsulting.com. That Melissa Doman Sleep Consulting is also where you can find me on Facebook. And on Instagram, my handle is Special Needs Sleep Coach.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, we're super appreciative of your time, and I will share this to everyone in all of the places. And I even learned a little bit, which since I've been at it this long, that's surprising, but I knew you'd be a wealth of information. And I'm sure this will help a lot of families. So thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have you back again.
Okay. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.